This podcast is meant for informational purposes only and is not meant to serve as investment advice. Hosts and guests may hold cryptocurrencies discussed in this episode. Opinions expressed may not reflect the opinions of Messari.
What if I told you there is a DePIN project out there that was already doing over 1 million in annualized revenue, had the lowest device payback period in the industry, and already had twice as many coverage nodes deployed as its incumbent competitor? And that you've probably never heard of it. It's called Geonet, and they're building a global RTK network. RTK networks don't get a lot of attention, but are considered critical infrastructure in very large industries like agriculture, construction, logistics, drones, augmented reality, and others. I'll explain what they are, how Geonet is trying to build a better one, and how I went about coming up with a valuation for Geonet. I'm Dylan Bane, and here's the story.
This episode of Unqualified Opinions is brought to you by Hirechain. Your next hire could come from anywhere: a recruiter, a job board, a referral network, or a conference. Hirechain manages hundreds of candidate sources for you, so you only see relevant applications and can focus on picking the best person for your team. On average, our customers fill open roles faster and 30% cheaper than with traditional recruiters. Leading companies like The Graph and Messari already use Hirechain. So get your time back. Talk to Hirechain today and hire the best, fast. Visit hirechain.io/Messari for prioritized onboarding.
Hey Dylan, welcome back.
Good to be on.
So let's start with the basics, because I think the problem GEODNET solves probably isn't that familiar to a lot of people, even though it's considered critical infrastructure to many businesses. So what is RTK and what is it used for?
So RTK refers to real-time kinematics. So basically, we have these things called global navigation satellite systems. So things like GPS or GLONASS. And basically, when a satellite connects to a device on Earth, they get really close to the right location, but due to the environment and various disruptions in their signal, they're often 10 to 20 feet off from the true location on Earth that they're trying to position. So what an RTK-based system does is it basically has a base station that's deployed on Earth. So this can be on like a rooftop, and it corrects the satellite's positioning error from 10 to 20 feet to basically 1 centimeter precision. So you're getting the exact location of a device on Earth. And this provides the highest level of accuracy for systems like GPS. So if you have high precision farming where you need to be right on the dot for what you're doing, or like an augmented reality use case like Pokemon Go, or like an Amazon drone delivery type service down the road, you need exact location. And this is kind of what creates the market for these RTK devices. And I'll say, like, there's a wide range of technologies. So there's like this thing called cores, which is related to RTK. There's PPP, and they're all these kind of correction services. But basically, at the present day, RTK is the most effective at getting to 1 centimeter level precision in real time. So it's the most valuable and useful tech for positioning errors.
So let's move on to GEODNET. How does GEODNET help this?
Yeah, so basically, there are a few issues with how correction data works at the moment. So most of these networks that do correction data are ran by governments, whether that's like a state government in the US or national government, like India's CORES network. And they provide these services for free, but it's often outdated. Like the technology is kind of decades old, or they don't have consistent coverage, or it's very slow. And if you need reliable, real-time, high-quality data, these networks basically don't work well. So if you can't use a government-run service, then you can deploy your own RTK type station, which is very expensive, requires a lot of expertise. Not a lot of companies or people are able to do that. Or you can subscribe to a private RTK subscription service through a normal centralized company. But the issue here is they're often very local, they're not global. They're also sometimes have outdated technology. A lot of these RTK networks are integrated into a much larger business where RTK isn't the core focus. So it's a bit disorganized, it's complex, it can be expensive. So there's a lot of issues present with that as well. So where Geonet comes in is it basically lowers the cost of deploying an RTK network, and it makes it much easier to scale the network globally. So normally, if you're trying to deploy an RTK station, it can usually cover around 20 to 40 kilometers of an area. So you need to basically distribute these all over the earth. And to do that, you need to have real estate, which is very expensive. So you're going to have to rent it out. You're going to have to get permits. You're going to have to deploy certain systems. This can cost upwards of 25K all in per station. So it's very expensive to expand the network. Whereas with a DePIN model, which Geonet is deploying, you can basically just have an infrastructure provider who owns the real estate deploy an RTK base station. It only costs $700, no real estate costs, very low OpEx. You just set it in place and it goes. And you basically, just for $700, you can deploy a new node. You cover 20 to 40 kilometers. And it's much easier to scale globally because anyone can just join the network, put down a node. So what this enables is basically the first global RTK network at a much lower cost that a centralized company would have a hard time justifying in terms of CapEx investment to do the same thing. So at present, Geonet has over 10,000 nodes. They launched 2 years ago. The second largest RTK network is ran by this large corporation called Trimble. That's about 5,000 nodes. Trimble's been in operations for decades now. So basically, Geonet's already deployed the world's largest RTK network for far cheaper, and it's massively scalable just due to the nature of DePIN.
Okay, so let's talk about their progress so far.
Yeah, so Geonet, like I mentioned, has over, I think, 10,200 nodes now. So on the supply side, it basically already serves most of what expected demand is just from Europe and North America. We project in our report that with 20 to 25,000 nodes, Geonet can meet most of global demand. And they would be on track to reach that in 2025 or 2026 based on growth in prior years. And then for full global coverage, literally everywhere, would be 80 to 100K nodes, which we think they can reach by 2029. But in terms of meeting most demand, they don't even need to deploy most of that network. They just need 20,000 nodes, which will probably happen next year. So on the demand side, they're doing 1.2 million in annualized revenue. So Geonet has a token model where basically all the revenue for Geonet on demand side comes from the Geonet Foundation selling the collective RTK data of all the base stations on the network to end buyers, whether that's through wholesalers or directly to the end buyer or through a different distribution channel. And then they use 80% of that revenue to buy and burn the Geode token, which basically creates value accrual and upwards price pressure on the Geode token. And then the other 20% of revenue is used to operate the foundation. You can think of it as OpEx for the company.
Now let's switch gears to their token and talk about how they've set up their token. This will be pretty familiar to those who know DePIN, but probably still worth outlining.
Yeah, so basically, if you deploy an RTK base station, you get rewards and Geo tokens as compensation for providing RTK correction services. And this is your base reward. Network wise, base rewards are halved every year on June 30th. So it started out at around 2 tokens per day in 2022, then 12, then 6 now. And this is actually a very high ROI investment for a base station deployer. It's currently the fastest repayment period in all of DePIN for buying a GeoNet station. So it's about 150 days now, I think. And basically, you can also increase your rewards if you deploy base station in an especially high value area. This is decided by the Geonet governance team and customers as a pretty sophisticated system of staking where Geo token holders can stake their tokens to kind of create a multiplier effect in high value regions. And then GeoNet station deployers in those areas receive more tokens. Geonet also balances this out by distributing rewards efficiently in terms of location. So if there's already a lot of geode stations somewhere, you'll get less proportionate rewards until 0. And this manages kind of token emissions to make sure tokens are being distributed to new locations, which provide previously inaccessible RTK correction data. And then on the supply side, I think I described this a bit earlier, but basically the Geonet protocol makes all this data available to Geonet Foundation, and then they sell all the data to end buyers. And then Geonet Foundation uses all that revenue, 80% buy and burn, on the Geo token, just buying in the open market. All this value accrues to Geo token, which kind of kicks in a flywheel effect, making a token more valuable, which brings in more RTK station providers, which in turn means more data, which means more revenue, and so forth.
In your report, you estimated a valuation for GeoDNet in 2030. I won't ask you to give the valuation out here, but can you talk about some of the data points you used to come up with that?
Yeah, so we basically went through a ton of research on the RTK market, and we estimate that there's about a 3 to 3.5 billion total addressable market right now for RTK correction services, and we think that will go up to between 4 to 5 billion by 2030. And then we kind of went deep into how companies like Trimble operate their RTK network. And we basically found what they're creating in revenue and what percentage of the total market that is. And then we, based on that, we estimated what we think are reasonable market penetration rates for GeoNet. So projecting out revenue growth for the RTK market, we obviously are seeing tailwinds in the AR, autonomous vehicle, drone space markets, and we think that GeoNet might be able to capture a portion of these revenues based on being the first global RTK network and having a first mover advantage and having deep expertise and industry experience on the founding GeoNet team. However, obviously there's a lot that's uncertain about these markets. The data is not always clear about the true amount of revenue accruing to RTK. These are obviously just assumptions.
So what are some of the risks to them achieving this vision? What are their current prospective customers still asking for that they can't provide yet?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting with Geonet is that the supply side can be built fairly efficiently using a DePIN model. So we think, or basically to build a 20K node RTK network, it's 700 a node and it's 14 million in CapEx distributed across all the infra providers. So using DePIN, you can bypass a lot of these real estate costs and permitting costs, which makes it fairly cheap. So while a centralized model can't really compete with Geonet, other DePINs could spin up and provide higher rewards to early adopters. and basically might be able to take market share from Geonet. And the risk is if it's too easy to build out the supply side, then the data will become commoditized, and this is going to reduce the potential TAM of Geonet. So basically, Geonet needs to focus more on the demand side in the long term, since I think they have the supply side pretty figured out on the DePIN side. A lot of this is going to be, creating tailored packages of data and products for end customers, developing relationships, which I've said already that Geonet has a pretty strong team with like lots of industry experience. So really leveraging those relationships. They also have really large institutional relationships. So they partnered with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to do high precision farming throughout the U.S. So kind of building up their brand, creating custom tailored solutions, and leveraging relationships will be very important on demand side to kind of create a moat that can sustain their market share and fend off any potential DePIN competitors.
Dylan, that was great. Thanks so much for joining today.
My pleasure. Always happy to be on. This episode was produced by Steve Bichimer based on my report on GeoDNet in October 2024. To read more about DePIN, please consider subscribing to Messari Pro at messari.io.